Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. Today's guest is John Davis. John Davis is the director of the Rewilding Institute, whose origin goes back to the Earth First movement and the publication in 1989 of Dave Foreman and Howie Walk's classic book, The Big Outside. John was the editor of the Wild Earth Journal from 1991 to 1996. He is an expert on landscape connectivity mapping, based not only on his knowledge of the science of conservation biology, but on thousands of miles of walking across the wildest parts of the United States. In 2011, he published TREKEAST, a personal journey walking nearly 7,600 miles in search of a possible future Eastern Wildway. And in 2013, he walked, canoed, and biked 5,000 miles from Sonora, Mexico to British Columbia on what he calls the Western Wildway, an idea that he will explain to us today. This journey has been made into a documentary film called Born to Rewild. I call John the Wilderness Man because there is no one, as far as I know, who knows more about the current state of wilderness in the continental United States than he does. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Glenn. It's an honor to talk with you.
Can you explain what rewilding means and why it is important for North America?
Yes. The term rewilding was coined 2 decades or so ago. My mentor and friend Dave Foreman, a great wilderness champion, particularly in the American West, but really a wilderness champion for all of North America and even other continents. And what Dave meant by rewilding was large-scale wilderness recovery, including the restoration of missing species, particularly the top carnivores that are so important for ecosystem health and stability. Other people have defined rewilding in slightly different ways. My friend and longtime colleague Tom Butler likes to describe rewilding as helping nature heal. And I have tried to put it a little more poetically in some of the things I've said and written, and I've referred to rewilding as giving the land back to wildlife and wildlife back to the land. But an essential element of rewilding, and by the way, Dave Foreman, Tom Butler, and I all work very closely together, so our ideas overlap and complement one another. And Tom and I were essentially students of Dave Foreman, very heavily influenced by his thinking and his activism. And as Dave would say still today, were he with us, sadly he passed away a few years ago, Dave would say an essential element of rewilding, and I think most of us involved in it agree, is that the goal is self-willed land and self-willed creatures. That is, the goal is to step back and let nature be, not manipulate it, not try to control it. It is recognized by rewilding advocates that there are places that are so damaged we may need to help, and that's one reason why Tom Butler gives the definition, helping nature heal. There may be clear cuts where active replanting of native species is important. There are areas, including where I live in Adirondack Park, where if we are to regain the full biota, we have to do some active restoration. The chances of cougars returning to the eastern United States without help are very slim for reasons I can explain later. But the goal of rewilding is full, complete, natural ecosystems that then self-regulate and run by their own rules, not by humans. And actually, I should add, in terms of the components of a typical rewilding vision, they include very large wilderness core reserves linked by broad wildlife corridors and buffered in many cases by sustainable management areas, which might include sustainable forestry or light touch ranching. But it's very important in any rewilding vision to have true wilderness, that is, areas we let be, and have those big wilderness cores connected by wildlife corridors. Now, in an ideal world, actually, we might see the matrix reversed, so that the matrix is wild, and the connections might actually be between human communities. There might be narrow connections between small human communities. But in heavily developed or fragmented landscapes, the core buffer wildlife corridor model is accepted as being an important component of rewilding.
So what does a wild earth look like in practical terms? How much land are we talking about?
Different people have different views on that. I believe that the notion popularized initially by Reed Noss, the great conservation biologist Reed Noss, and later even more publicly by the late great biologist E.O. Wilson, of protecting at least half of Earth in nature reserves. I believe that's a viable vision. I think it's increasingly accepted by conservation biologists and naturalists and just people who care about nature, that we need to protect, probably to stem the extinction crisis and the climate crisis, by the way. We need to protect at least half of Earth, the lands and waters of Earth, in truly wild reserves. Now, it may vary some by region. In a Rewilding North America vision, we'd probably aim for well over half in the American West, and maybe something like half, maybe something like half in much of the Appalachians, likely more than half in the northern Appalachians and Adirondacks, but we might have to settle for less than half in the so-called breadbasket, the former tall grass prairie areas that are so rich for farming that they are mostly taken over by agriculture and agribusiness. And it will be a long time before we can reasonably hope that Iowa, for instance, is going to be half wild. But I think it is achievable, even in a heavily agribusiness dominated state like Iowa. Some rewilding is possible and is critical. And the place to start, and this is not my idea, I've heard this idea from Iowa conservation leaders. The place to start in Iowa or in other states that are heavily developed is in floodplains and other flood-prone areas and on steep slopes, which are not, they're not very productive in the long term for agriculture anyway. People end up losing their homes. They end up losing their crops. We should see government programs to just buy out the floodplains, the riparian zones, and the steep slopes and give those back to nature. So even in a heavily developed area like Iowa, we should be able to achieve a substantial fraction, I would guess at least a fourth, of the land and water as wild. So it will vary by region, but on average, at least 50% of each region, and I would say that's a minimum goal.
So what are some of the biggest challenges you face in expanding wilderness areas and in creating corridors, wildways, and wildlife crossings?
I'll start with what I think is one of the fundamental drivers of both the extinction crisis and the climate crisis, and yet a problem most environmentalists and conservationists don't want to talk about, and people from outside those communities are even less apt to talk about. Human overpopulation. I don't believe that our planet can sustainably, fairly support 8 billion people. We're at 8 billion and it's still rapidly growing, contrary to what some people claim. The idea that the birth dearth proponents are just absolutely wrong or foolish or selfish. The world's population continues to grow rapidly. The United States population is growing quite rapidly, primarily, admittedly, because of immigration, at least until recently. But the U.S. population is still growing. And human population growth, along with excessive consumption, is terribly hard on wildlife and on wildlife habitat. So if we are to achieve, if we're to stop the extinction crisis, solve the climate crisis, and find some degree of equity between people, we need to, in compassionate and peaceful and voluntary ways, allow human numbers to decline by encouraging small, close families. I'm not advocating draconian measures at all. They won't work and they'll be cruel. But through voluntary measures and education, and I think that the experts in demography and population ecology, I think, agree that the paths that consistently work in different cultures are education of girls and empowerment of women. If we go in those directions, we can probably be optimistic that human population will gradually decline to more sustainable levels. I don't think we should have even a fourth the number of people on Earth in the long run that we have now. I think 1 billion or less is a much more reasonable number. And with that number, we could have the high arts and other wonderful forms of culture that we appreciate. Those need not be lost with lower numbers. In fact, they would probably flourish more because we'd be less crowded. We'd have more room for creativity. We'd have more room to walk the wild places. We'd have more room to walk in wilderness, as you have so eloquently advocated, Cliff. So that's I'm rambling. But one.
No, you're not.
I would say start with that fundamental problem. We need to be willing to talk about the fact we are too many in numbers and levels of consumption. The human population is too big and we consume too much. We have to address those problems or the world will not be livable for people, much less wildlife, within a century. The second challenge is growing alien, and we hear a lot about this even in popular media to some degree, the growing alienation of people from nature, largely because of technology. These digital gadgets that so many of us use, and I'm on one right now, I'm talking on a cell phone, these do distance us from nature. We spend too much time looking at our screens or driving in our cars, not enough time walking in the wilderness. Again, walking in the wilderness being so valuable. People need to feel attached to wild places or they won't care about them. As David Brower used to say, I don't remember his exact words, but something like, we advocate for the places we love, and we protect the places we advocate. I don't have the wording right, but basically, we need people to have an affinity for the natural areas around them, or they won't speak out for them. So that's another major problem, alienation from nature. And closely related to that, is ecological ignorance. I don't mean this in a demeaning way toward anybody, but our schools do not teach us natural history, or at least not much. They do not teach us conservation biology. They do not teach us what other species need to live. How many of us can even begin to describe what, say, a bear or a wolf or a trout or a salmon or a songbird or an eagle needs to live? We just don't understand their needs, and so we trample their needs essentially partly because of ignorance. And then, of course, greed. Old-fashioned greed, avarice, is a terrible problem, and it seems to be worsening. Some of the people in power right now, especially in the United States, but in other countries too, seem to be driven primarily by greed, arrogance, and even narcissism. And that certainly stands in the way of achieving goals for protecting and restoring wildlife habitat. And then, we could think about what some people might call the low-hanging fruit. What are some of the problems that actually would be relatively easy to solve? And one of them, and this is crucial for rewilding, is the barriers posed by human development, especially roads. Roads, as Dave Foreman said, the beginning of the end for a wilderness is the construction of roads. Everywhere our roads go, tragedy follows from the perspective of wildlife. There's direct killing, roadkill. There's the many effects of habitat fragmentation. There's increased access for poachers. There are altered microclimates. A whole host of problems come with roads. But to some degree, we can ameliorate those effects if we could encourage lower nighttime speed limits. If we would put in safe wildlife crossings where the animals are trying to move, we could greatly lessen the fragmenting and lethal effects of roads. And so that's one of the easier problems to at least partially solve is roadkill. no, very few people, even people who don't care much about wildlife, don't like to see roadkill. And obviously it involves suffering, pain. It's tragic. It's pointless. I think we could get most Americans and most Canadians and most people in other countries to agree we should try to stop the problem of roadkill, and it's an achievable goal. Beth Pratt of National Wildlife Federation just raised $100 million to install a wildlife crossing on a busy interstate highway in Southern California, in Liberty Canyon, largely on behalf of pumas. It's an enormously popular project. Ben Goldfarb has just written a terrific book about wildlife crossings. I think the name of it's Crossings, I'm forgetting, but it's a very good and important book about the value of and the need for wildlife crossings. So that's one of the low-hanging fruit is getting safe wildlife crossings on busy roads.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, those are among the basic challenges. And then, as again, my mentor Dave Foreman used to point out, often one of the hindrances for our efforts is just lack of imagination, lack of courage, lack of boldness, lack of vision. This is particularly evident in the East, where I spend most of my time these days. We here in Adirondack Park, which I call my home, we have plenty of habitat for cougars and wolves, plenty of prey and habitat for them. But we cannot get state wildlife officials to even talk about the idea of restoring them. They just don't have, frankly, the courage or the vision to imagine cougars and wolves being back in New York State. To them, it's unthinkable. We've been developed for centuries now. Those species were eradicated more than 100 years ago. Why would we even think of bringing them back? That seems to be their attitude. So we have to encourage people to have some courage and some imagination and be willing to consider bringing these missing species home.
Thanks for that great answer. Just a comment on population. I read that if each family had no more than 2 children, that single measure alone could make a very big difference.
Huge difference. A huge difference. Yeah, if we could encourage an ethic of a cultural value of small, close families, and if most families had 2 or fewer children, the population would stabilize, and there would be no. I mean, there are some laws that probably need to be changed. There are essentially pro-natalist policies in our tax code, for instance, that need to be changed. But I'm not advocating placing strict limits on the numbers of children people can have. I just think we need to encourage an ethic of small, close families and caring communities, and then look at unhealthy economic incentives that favor procreation.
So how do you work with local communities, indigenous groups, and governments to advance the vision?
I don't do as much of it as I should, and probably none of us do. I think that's not always the strength of conservation advocates. There are groups and individuals who are very good at outreach to local people. I haven't proven to be very effective in that realm, but it is crucial. We will not get very far with rewilding visions unless we can gain support from local people. We need the support of some of the more difficult groups to convince on carnivore recovery, particularly are hunters and trappers and farmers and ranchers. So those are among the first people we should reach out to, because as long as the hunting and trapping community is very powerful, at least in some areas, including where I live in northern New York, it's very powerful. Farmers and ranchers as an interest group tend to be very powerful. As long as they're opposed to carnivore recovery, we probably will not succeed. As long as they're opposed to new wilderness designations, they are very difficult to achieve. So outreach to those communities is important. I think Native American tribes tend to be natural allies, but that's a very sensitive area of work for obvious reasons. The abuse of and cruelty toward Native groups around the world, really, but particularly here in North America, is well known, and it's horrifying, and it needs to be. We need to make up for those past sins in some way. So I think with Native groups, I think approaching them with humility, and probably listening more than talking is very important, but trying to find common ground. Dennis Sizemore, a friend of mine who ran Round River Conservation Studies for decades, has proven through the years to be very effective at outreach to Native groups. And he's told me that it's very important to be honest about your aims, but be humble enough to hear about their aims first.
Mm-hmm.
Don't start by telling what you're trying to accomplish. Start by asking them, what do you imagine for this landscape? Or what do you think of the wildlife we have here and what we've lost? Listen to them, and then in an honest and humble way, present your vision and see if you can find some common ground. But he really emphasizes the importance of listening. He says it's very important to listen, particularly to the elders, and often especially to the women elders who seem to have special wisdom and knowledge and community ties. With local people more generally, I think one of the obvious things we need to do more of is just talk with them. We don't too often, and I think this is increasingly a problem in the digital age with social media. Too often we don't really talk with our neighbors much. We may say hello at the post office, but we don't often enough get together with them and actually talk about lands and wildlife and who has an interest in this patch of forest and who might have seen a wolf or a bobcat over here and what did they think of it. I think talking with our neighbors is very, very important. One-on-one in equitable situations, maybe over a game of volleyball or a potluck or a walk. I think a whole lot more of that sort of grassroots communication is very important to achieving our conservation goals. And partly because there's so much misunderstanding between different interest groups. I suspect if you were to talk with most hunters who live near public lands, they would say they greatly value those public lands. It may be the only place they can legally hunt. And yet we don't all that often see conservationists and hunters working together to expand wilderness areas or to reintroduce wolves or cougars. So we need more of that communication and cooperation.
What about government on the local, state, and federal level? Is the Institute place a lot of importance on that?
Yes, it's very important. And there, one of the crucial elements of our work, I think, is to get more thoughtful, conservation-minded people to run for local office. By and large, all over rural America, local politics is dominated by a good old boy network, basically, to use perhaps a derogatory, but I think not entirely unfair label. But most of these good old boys are nice. They're very friendly. They'll pull you out of a ditch if you slide off the road. They're good, wholesome people. But they're often not interested in wildlife recovery. They're often suspicious of government involvement in land management. So they often stand in the way of conservation measures. So I think talking to those local officials is very important. I think it's probably equally important to run against them. Get some people who care about wildlands to run for local offices, run for county commissioner, run for sheriff, and run for the state assembly and that sort of thing. We don't do enough of that. It's partly, I think, because many of us who consider ourselves liberal, we don't really have the stomach for those long meetings and cumbersome bureaucratic processes. But so many land use decisions are lost at the local level. We really have to get involved in electoral politics at local and county and state levels as well as the federal level.
So what are some of the economic benefits or opportunities that rewilding might bring to rural or urban areas?
An obvious one is ecotourism or wildlife-based tourism, wildlife watching, a simple term for it. There are more and more people in our country, at least there were until recently. I hope this trend continues. More and more people who are interested not in shooting or hooking or trapping wildlife necessarily, but just in watching it. And wildlife watching, I believe, as an economic revenue source is bigger than hunting and trapping these days. I'm not sure if it's bigger than fishing. I suspect it's comparable anyway. And the number of wildlife watchers, I think, at this point in the United States far exceeds the number of hunters and trappers. Mm-hmm. So wildlife watching and ecotourism are one obvious type of benefit. Then there's some less tangible but equally important opportunities. Rewilded landscapes will provide a whole host of economic indirectly, but directly ecological benefits. With wild landscapes, we have clean air, we have clean water, we have pollination, we have climate stabilization. So there are a whole host of ecological and economic benefits that ensue when we protect places, and somehow those need to be valued and rewarded. One of the best things we could do to protect more lands and waters across North America is figure out ways to basically pay private landowners to conserve their wildlife habitat and to allow restoration of missing wildlife. Too many places, including where I live, the economic pressures on landowners are to exploit, to subdivide the land and sell it for development, or cut down the trees and sell them for pulp or lumber, or clear the land and put out livestock. The way landowners make money on their land, and many landowners need to make money on their land, is through exploitation. We need to change it so that landowners can make more money, or at least equal money, from conservation. And if we did full cost accounting in our economy, that would make sense, because the direct ecological benefits and the indirect economic benefits of rewilding are so immense that if we were actually accounting for them and conversely forcing those who cause ecological harm to pay for it, why, it would make good sense for landowners to protect their trees. But we need to find a way to pay for that. We need to find a way to pay for so-called ecosystem services. I hate that we have to talk in utilitarian terms. I believe that we should be protecting and restoring wildlife simply because it has inherent beauty and worth, and because we want to live in a beautiful world. I wish it were that way, but it's not really at present. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the almighty dollar, as it's often called, rules still. Mm-hmm. And so, unfortunately, I'm afraid we do need, for at least some landowners, we do need to figure out how they can benefit economically from protecting and restoring wildlands and wildlife.
In a world facing climate change, why is rewilding a necessary strategy?
Climate chaos, as I prefer to call it, or global overheating, I think those are more apt terms than climate change. Of course, it is climate change, but that sounds relatively benign, as does global warming, so I prefer the other terms. So how does rewilding help with those problems? It helps in multiple ways. One, old-growth forests and old-growth grasslands, other natural, unaltered or recovering ecosystems sequester huge amounts of carbon. Various studies show that old forests sequester more carbon than young forests. And the foresters who try to convince us that the way to maximize carbon sequestration in a forest is by sustainable logging and putting the wood into durable products, I think have their math wrong or their science wrong. The research I'm seeing does not suggest that. Now, I grant that as long as Americans want or need paper and lumber and other wood products, we should probably be getting those from our own regions and not we shouldn't be importing trees from other countries. To the extent we truly need fiber from trees to produce paper and pulp and lumber, we should get it from our own lands. But we shouldn't as Jamie Sine, a colleague of mine here in the northern Appalachians and Adirondacks region, likes to say, we should be cutting many fewer trees and getting much more out of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that holds for many types of ecosystems. We will continue to need the natural resources from some of our lands and waters, but we should be much more frugal, much more efficient, much less wasteful in how we use them. And if we are much less wasteful, we can stop exploiting so much of the landscape and give much of it back to wildlife. In effect, rewild much of the lands and waters of this country.
What myths or misconceptions do you encounter about wilderness and rewilding?
Several. Oh, actually, before I move on to that, I should have also said regarding climate.
Mm-hmm.
So the carbon sequestration is part of the value of rewilding. Another part is just the connectivity, because as the climate warms, many species will need to move northward or upward in elevation to track their climate envelope. So habitat connections are increasingly important in a warming world. So that's another argument. And then there's also this emerging concept of animating the carbon cycle. There are studies showing that top predators like wolves and lions and mega herbivores like elephants and whales play very important roles in the carbon cycle, and over time, in effect, greatly increase carbon sequestration rates in given ecosystems. So we will sequester more carbon by restoring the big animals, basically. So that's a third area of climate benefit from rewilding. So misconceptions about rewilding. Well, one of the fairly surprisingly common ones, and a slightly amusing one to me anyway, is that many folks initially think we're talking about bringing back woolly mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers when we talk about rewilding. There is the concept out there of Pleistocene rewilding, which argues that our landscapes were badly diminished by the extirpation of the mega herbivores and the extra large carnivores 10 to 15,000 years ago. This is still being debated, but I think there's growing evidence to suggest that early human hunters in North America and South America, and to a lesser extent in Eurasia, exterminated many of the mega mammals through overhunting. Possibly there were climate effects also, and possibly spread of disease. It may have been a multivariate situation with more than one factor, but it looks increasingly probable that human hunters did play a pretty heavy hand in the extermination of dozens of megafaunal species, especially in North and South America 10 to 15,000 years ago. So partly because of that, some paleontologists, perhaps in communication with genetic engineers, have wondered about somehow trying to revive those missing species, get some DNA from a mammoth tusk, perhaps, and somehow maybe using an Asian elephant, maybe you can somehow bring back woolly mammoths onto the land. So that concept is called Pleistocene rewilding, and it certainly has an appeal to it. But I argue that Pleistocene rewilding at present is almost imaginary. It seems likely that it seems unlikely that it could succeed, and it may distract us from some real and immediate rewilding opportunities. Before we invest resources in trying to restore dire wolves, which are a larger wolf species on North America, let's restore the wolves we have had into historic times, red and gray and timber and eastern wolves. And I know there are genetic questions about where to draw the species lines there, but we have native wolves in North America that are still here, but have been exterminated from much of the continent, particularly in the United States. Let's restore those. And then if the technology someday safely allows, then maybe we could consider the almost miraculously bringing back the mega herbivores. But I would rather I think actually there's some value in the Pleistocene rewilding dialogue, just because it shows how modest the goals of rewilding practitioners really are. I mean, talking about restoring the gray wolf is a pretty small ask as compared to restoring dire wolves and the mega herbivores they ate. So I think there's some value in the Pleistocene rewilding concept, but that's not what rewilding advocates in practice are talking about, generally, anyway. So that's one common misconception. Another common one, and a more pernicious one, I think, is that rewilding advocates are anti-human, or are talking about human exclusion zones, or getting rid of people, or moving cities or towns. We're not talking about that. Credible conservationists are not calling for moving cities or towns, unless perhaps there are safety reasons why it's necessary to think about them. And there are places that are probably doomed this century by climate chaos, places that will flood too much or burn too much. And then it may be humane to talk about voluntary measures to encourage people to move out of those zones. But rewilding advocates are not talking about forcing people to move. We are not anti-human by any means. In fact, most of us as individuals really like other individuals, and our active community members are involved in humanitarian efforts as well as wildlife conservation efforts. So that's the notion that rewilding advocates are misanthropes. It's just false. It's not true. But that charge does get leveled at us occasionally. So those are two misconceptions that I would. Oh, and then I think a third one, and I also consider this one a bit pernicious, is that I think that too often the distinction between sustainably managed landscapes and truly wild or rewilded landscapes is blurred. And I think actually conservationists themselves deserve some of the blame here. Now, some of the big land trusts have, in recent years, put partial protection in the form of conservation easements on big landscapes, often commercial forest lands or ranch lands, and then called them protected. They probably, in most cases, if there's a conservation easement on them, they are partially protected. They're protected from subdivision and housing development, but they're probably not protected from the commercial forestry or the ranching that was happening beforehand. In commercial forestry and ranching, there are reasons to do them because American people want the products produced by forestry and ranching. There are reasons to do those activities in some places. But to call those lands saved or protected is, to my mind, a bit misleading. And I think that the American public is not knowledgeable anymore, if it ever was, and is in some cases outright confused about what is the difference between protected area designation and sustainable management. There's a big difference, and we should not blur that distinction. I think it's fine if the best a land trust can do is buy the development rights and allow the logging or the ranching to continue, but in a sustainable fashion, that's fine. But be honest about that. Don't celebrate that you've just saved 100,000 acres. Say we have partially protected 100,000 acres while allowing the commercial economic activity to continue. There's a place for that kind of so-called working landscape conservation. This is probably a very important place for that in the large conservation picture. But it is not the same as wilderness protection. It is not the same as rewilding. And I think that distinction needs to be made.
So what are some of the major projects the Institute is currently working on?
One you mentioned early on, Glenn, is the Western Wildway, or as Dave Foreman and Michael Soule often called it, the spine of the continent. And that second continental trek I did in 2013 was exploring the proposed Western Wildway, or spine of the continent conservation corridor. That's one of the most ambitious conservation goals in North America. A big part of it is very skillfully represented by the Y2Y Collaborative, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Collaborative. They do great work in the northern part of the larger spine of the continent connection, or the Western Wildway. And they have made many gains on the ground. And south of Yellowstone, of course, there are numerous wilderness wildlife groups that have made many gains on the ground within Western Wildway. But we're still a long way from having a permanently protected continental conservation corridor running the length of the Rocky Mountains and through adjacent deserts and grasslands. That's a goal that the Rewilding Institute and partner groups continue to push. And within that continental wildway, there are smaller wildways that get a lot of emphasis from various conservation groups. The Rewilding Institute pays special attention to what we call the Mogollon Wildway. That's the upper elevation habitat, largely forested, often in ponderosa pine forests, from the Gila Wildlands Complex in southwest New Mexico to the Grand Canyon Wildlands Complex in northern Arizona. That's that wildlife corridor stands out in Google Maps or satellite imagery. It's essentially the southwest edge of the Colorado Plateau. It's an upper elevation area with, again, much pine and other conifer forest. If you look on in satellite imagery, you can see that the Mogollon Wildway is part of you can almost make out a loop. If you look at a satellite map of the western states, maybe zero in on Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, you can see there's almost a loop formed by upper elevation habitat, mountain habitat. Carlos Carroll, a great conservation biologist, identified or recognized this many years ago in a wolf habitat suitability map that he did. This is, wolves can and should live throughout the West, but they're going to want to spend much of their time in forested areas where there's more prey, in relatively well-watered areas where they can more easily find elk and deer and other prey. The Colorado Plateau, the desert parts of the Colorado Plateau, should have wolves and pumas and other wide-ranging carnivores, but they're probably going to be lower in number because, of course, that's a very arid landscape where the prey is quite sparse. But again, if you look at this Carlos Carroll wolf habitat suitability map, you can make out almost a loop. Mogollon Wildway is the southwestern part of that loop. The upper elevation plateaus of central Utah are part of that. The San Juan Mountains are, of course, a critical part of that. San Juan Mountains, to my mind, are one of the wildest landscapes in the western United States, and one with some of the greatest rewilding opportunities. Lynx have been reintroduced to the San Juans and apparently are doing okay, holding on at least, maybe even expanding in number. I don't know the latest numbers. I wish that Colorado Division of Wildlife had included the San Juans as well as the Rocky Mountain National Park in its wolf reintroduction effort. I don't know why they did not consider it, or they probably did consider it. I don't know why they didn't choose the San Juans, and the Rocky Mountain National Park just seems such an obvious place to consider. It's practically overrun with elk, and the wildlife viewing opportunities there would be outstanding. Anyway, so the Rewilding Institute is paying special attention to Mogollon Wildway. We are looking with interest at that loop made by the mountains of the Southwest as prime carnivore recovery country. On the other end of the other side of the continent, where I live in Adirondack Park, we have some active wildway efforts underway. There's a local wildlife corridor in which I live called Split Rock Wildway. The Rewilding Institute and Adirondack Council, for whom I work, and other conservation groups have been advocating for many years, linking, again, Lake Champlain with the Adirondack High Peaks at a large, really rewilding is done ideally at all scales from local to global. And we need to think about habitat connections at all levels from local to global. So if just to take an example where I'm very involved, Split Rock Wildway is a local level wildlife corridor linking the Champlain Valley with the Adirondack High Peaks. The regional scale wildway of which it is a part is known as A2A, the Adirondack to Algonquin Wildway or Wildlife Corridor, which runs through Adirondack Park into southern Ontario's Algonquin Park and offers probably the best chance for wolf recovery in the northeastern United States. And then that in turn is part of a much larger proposed Eastern Wildway or Appalachian Atlantic Adirondack Wildway. And that's one way to look at rewilding projects or habitat connectivity projects. Think locally, regionally, and continentally, and ultimately globally as well. And the Rewilding Institute tries to do that. The Rewilding Institute is a very small, lean team, runs on a modest budget, and so it has to be pretty careful where we invest resources. But those Mogollon Wildway and Adirondack Wildways are two areas where the Rewilding Institute tends to give extra attention.
How does the Institute fit into the global context of conservation? Are there international partnerships or collaborations that you work with?
Yes, there's a global rewilding alliance of which we are a part. The Global Rewilding Alliance is a loose-knit network of rewilding groups, regional, national, a few continental, like the Rewilding Institute. And the Global Rewilding Alliance has a good website. They've actually been promoting this animating the carbon cycle concept, which is another argument for large carnivore and mega herbivore recovery. They've been very instrumental in that. They're doing quite a bit of good education around the value of rewilding. They're helping connect groups together. You can hardly talk about rewilding without mentioning Tompkins conservation. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the most effective rewilding projects in the world are happening in South America and Africa. There's some I'm less familiar with the projects in Africa, but I believe there have been more active species reintroduction and translocation efforts in Africa than on any other continent. Partly because of the value of wildlife watching to the economies of various African countries. Where lions have been extirpated on a conservancy landscape or in a national park, rangers and wildlife advocates and scientists may get together to figure out a way to bring back the rhinos or the lions or the missing animals. That's been done scores of times successfully in Africa. In South America, especially in Chile and Argentina, Tompkins Conservation, the entity formed by Doug and Chris Tompkins many years ago, has been enormously effective at buying and saving wildlands in southern Chile and Argentina, and then gradually restoring the missing species. And I'm very fortunate and proud to have worked closely with Doug and Chris Tompkins in the past. I was their biodiversity program officer many years ago, and I'm still close with Chris Tompkins and her teams in Rewilding Chile and Rewilding Argentina. They are heroes. They have literally saved tens of millions of acres. They've restored most of the missing species in several big landscapes now, particularly the vast Ibarra wetlands of Argentina. And one of the lessons from Tompkins conservation efforts is to have a big vision, but understand how to implement it incrementally. So Doug and Chris Tompkins, and I used to be privileged to be with them when they were doing this, would look at maps and think, well, here's a huge area with almost no people. The land is cheap. The farmers are trying to sell out anyway because it's so marginal. Let's start buying this land and see if we can create a national park. And then if we can do that, we can give it back to the Chilean people or the Argentinian people. And it probably will be positive economically, and certainly it will be positive ecologically. So they would start with a big vision on a map, but then they would actually go and talk with this rancher or that farmer or this business person who had holdings, and they'd figure out ways to slowly buy the lands from willing sellers, always fair prices, always very humanely, fairly done. And gradually they'd piece together huge areas and then eventually give them to the country as a national park. And then in terms of species reintroduction, they realized early on, you don't start with the most difficult species. So with Ibarra, it was missing several species, including jaguars. The Tompkins conservation team wanted to restore jaguars, but they knew if they started with jaguars, they would probably quickly find themselves embroiled in controversy, particularly because though Doug and Chris are very careful to employ local people, and the scientists they hire are from within country, and by and large their programs are run by local and regional people, not by outsiders. But still, Doug and Chris Tompkins themselves are from the United States, and everybody knows that. So they were really careful to employ local people, pay fair prices for the lands they bought, use local styles with the buildings, for instance. The cabañas would be built in a local style. They cared about the vernacular traditions and upheld those. And then with species recovery efforts, they started with popular, relatively easy to restore species. So they didn't start with jaguar. They started with the giant anteater and the military macaw, I think it is, and several other birds and giant otters, species that nobody would oppose and most people would love. And once they were successful restoring these less controversial species, or very popular species, in fact, that's when they started to talk about jaguar recovery. And they've been amazingly successful. Ibarras have been brought back to Ibarra, and they're now being brought back to another area where Tompkins Conservation has saved abundant land. called El Impenetrable. So they did this though they did their species recovery efforts very intelligently, sequentially, incrementally. They thought things through. They worked with local people. They did the easier things first. They advanced to the harder species. It's a different social and cultural context there, and the lessons from there certainly have value for our efforts here in North America. But it is a different situation. I think, for one thing, wildlife in the United States is governed primarily by states, and state wildlife agencies, unfortunately, are still to this day largely beholden to the hook and bullet crowd. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way necessarily. Most of my friends hunt or fish.
Do you believe in what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, an innate love for wild nature?
Yes, I do. And I believe one of our major challenges these days is to keep biophilia alive. I think that most young people who have exposure to nature are intrigued by it and are drawn to it and like to be in it or around it. But I think that can easily be lost, partly because of technology again. If people spend too much time on screens and in cars and away from nature, I think that can be lost. So I believe in biophilia, but I think it has to be nurtured or it can be lost.
Okay. What is the origin of your own love for the wild? Is it rooted in childhood experiences that you remember?
Yes, I'm fortunate. Unlike many conservationists and environmentalists, I did not have to rebel to reach this place of loving wild spaces and wanting to protect them. My parents encouraged it. My parents were Sierra Club members and National Wildlife Federation members, and my grandmother gave me Ranger Rick magazine from the time I was 5, I think. So I had encouragement from my family all along. My Aunt Joan would strategically give me books about wildlife as I aged that were more and more mature. So I had a lot of encouragement from my family. I was taken camping, hiking, climbing mountains, paddling, that sort of thing. So I had a lot of support. And I did have some formative experiences when I was young, including seeing a snowy owl in New Hampshire when I was 12 in a place where that was unlikely to see one. And so I had some formative experiences. I had a lot of support from my family, and I'm lucky. I was given access to wild nature, and it stuck.
I know that you recently spent time in Alaska.
Yes.
How would you describe the magnitude of wilderness you experienced there in comparison with wilderness areas in the lower 48 states?
Alaska is a great reminder of how life should be, in my opinion. When you go to Alaska, it's relatively easy to see abundant, big wildlife. You can fairly easily see bears and moose. Wolves you don't very often see, but you know they're there. You see their tracks. If you're on the coast, you may see seals, dolphins, whales. Alaska has never been ruined. Unlike the lower 48 or many parts of the lower 48, Alaska has never been heavily damaged. So the magnitude of wilderness and wildlife habitat on Alaska is exemplary. It's the way we should have it throughout our country. It's the way it should be throughout the world. Alaska is a very good model. And there are all sorts of problems with the politics in Alaska and how wildlife is managed in Alaska. But because so much of the state is still intact, even though the wildlife management is not very good, it's not very wildlife friendly, the wildlife is still abundant. Salmon runs are still abundant. Actually, the salmon management is relatively good in Alaska, but Alaska is a reminder of of how abundant and diverse wildlife should be. And Alaska is not an easy place for most animals. It's a reminder, especially because you realize it should be this way and more in areas that are easier for most animals to live. So the abundance we experience in Alaska should be even greater in much of the lower 48 states. And Alaska has actually, because of federal efforts more than state efforts, but much, I forget the fraction, I think at least a third of Alaska is in protected areas. So it has made a big start toward half Earth and beyond goals.
How can everyday people support or get involved in the rewilding movement?
I'm glad you asked that, Glenn. That's a perfect ending question. How can people get involved? So many ways to get involved in rewilding work. One is if there's a land trust in your area or a wildlife advocacy group or a wilderness protection group, volunteer, get involved, learn about their efforts, see if you can help them in some way. If you have money but not time, give them donations. If you have time but not money, donate some of your time for their efforts. Help protect wildlife and its habitat. A more political but equally important type of work is to get involved in state wildlife management decisions. Theoretically, wildlife governance is a democratic process. It's done mostly at the state, secondarily at the federal level. But state wildlife agencies and the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service need to hear much more often from people who care about wildlife for its own sake, not just because they can hook it or shoot it or in some way exploit it. So wildlife advocates, people who care about wild places, need to get involved in state wildlife decision making, and it's not an easy thing to figure out how to do. But it can help to start by go to your state wildlife agency website, see if they are inviting comments on proposals for hunting and trapping regulations of a particular species, or if they are looking for comments on the management of a wildlife management area. Get involved in those processes where there is public input invited, but too often there isn't much public input, especially not from wildlife advocates. If wildlife agencies were hearing from enough of us who care about wildlife, the cultures would change and they would support rewilding efforts.
Wonderful, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your great work, Glenn. It's an honor to talk with you, and never hesitate to write or call.
Okay, will do. Take care.
You will.
Bye-bye.
You bet. Bye.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. Thanks for listening. This is Glenn.